Wolfman. Yes, sorry, not Nosferatu yet. That'll be the next video because it is finally releasing on VOD, and it should be a decently long video because Eggers is an incredibly detailed guy. Today we're in another realm of horror classic monsters with the Wolfman. You know, Blumhouse horror in January. There's so many ways that could go. And sadly it went not great. But not great in a way that makes it funny, just in a way that makes it feel like such a waste in areas. And I say that thinking that a lot of this really works. Like, it's not another Night Swim, which was just such a wasted premise, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Wolfman is the latest movie by famed writer and director Leigh Whannell, primarily of Saw fame, but he also wrote Insidious, the 2018 movie Upgrade, and The Invisible Man from 2020, which this movie is supposed to be tangentially related to. Not in a way that makes it a whole ass dark universe, because that was a dumb idea, but movies that take these like classic monsters, specifically like the classic universal monsters, and modernizes those interpretations. Like the 2020 Invisible Man turned the story into an unreliable narrator nightmare of a woman being mentally tortured by her extremely wealthy, abusive tech bro ex, which I thought was a great way to explore and modernize that story. And since Whannell wrote and directed that one and was doing the same here, I really thought this was kind of almost guaranteed to be good. His writing can be pretty up and down, with later installments and franchises getting a little bit worse. Things kind of either work or they don't. But because of those highlights, I had faith in this. And it wasn't completely misplaced, you know? Like, despite some complaints of how he chose to switch up werewolf lore to the point that some people started questioning whether or not this would even count as werewolves, I thought the movie had a lot of really great ideas, some genuine moments of excellent tension, cool visuals, stuff that really sets it apart from everything else in the werewolf subgenre. And I love Christopher Abbott. He is one of my indie film festival darlings with movies like On the Count of Three, Black Bear, and of course, Sanctuary. Hell, you guys know I even liked him in Craven. Really hoping that his mainstream success gets a little bit better than these two last animal-related outings, but I still love them. But my hopes for how this movie was gonna go started to die when those early reviews started flooding in, and they were at best mid. And there's almost nothing worse than a mid at best movie. Like, I'll take a funny 1.5 star over a disappointing 3 star any day of the week. And I don't know why I was surprised. Like, January is so often a dumping ground for bad movies, and particularly bad horror movies, but there are exceptions. Mithrigan was fun and came out in January. Split came out in January. It's not all bad, it's just mostly bad. Invisible Man only held off until February and it rocked. But yeah, sadly my hopes were dashed because so much of this movie fails. For every moment of genuinely good tension, there's other moments that completely pull things to a standstill of awkward conversation or abandoned potential. Like, Invisible Man felt like a widely accessible movie that both worked as a solid psychological horror, an excellent example of an unreliable narrator's story, while tossing in those allegories that horror can do so well. And Wolfman is deeply interested in delivering those allegories to you with how it tells the stories, but feels like it has no faith in its audience to just be able to pick things up on what they're seeing. It will literally pause the plot to make sure you understand what was just being conveyed through what you were seeing, even if it just feels awkward in that moment. You will understand that this is an allegory for generational trauma. So if you couldn't tell, this Wolfman is pretty different from the original 1941 and 2010 remake, fully modernized, way more focused on family and the ways we try to avoid the sins of the father. And much like The Invisible Man modernized things to be tech-based over someone literally becoming invisible through science stuff, this Wolfman is also switching up how it handles the concept of a transformation, making it a pretty big departure from standard werewolf lore. Because in this movie, once someone is infected and starts to turn, they're always that creature. There's no going back, there's no changing under a full moon, you are just permanently a crazed beast. And honestly, that's pretty fucking scary. I get that it changes a lot of what werewolf stories can be an allegory for in their own right, but I think it's an interesting switch up. And because it works more like an infection spreading through the body over a supernatural occurrence, the transformation actually takes quite a while to settle in, which I thought was cool. I know throughout my life I've been upset by different forms of like less than typical representations of certain monsters in media, so I fully understand why this just wouldn't be working for some people, especially if like the Wolfman is something that means a lot to you, why you'd want it to be that standard Moonlight transformation. But I think I've just hit the point where I'm cool with media trying new things, especially when there's nothing stopping anyone else from making a different werewolf movie if they want to. It's not like a company getting the rights to something beloved and changing fundamental aspects of the lore and like knowing that's the one shot you're getting in your favorite piece of media for a really long time until the rights default or they decide to try again. Werewolves are just out there for anyone to play with, and this way you don't have to feel bad that it ruined one of your favorite classic movies because it's just trying to do its own thing. I will say there's some pretty cool aspects to it. Like, I really enjoyed the werewolf vision they gave him. It's just this like trippy blue and purple glow glow to everything, which was super fun. It actually kind of reminded me, those like the wolf shirts that used to be a thing like back in the 90s and stuff, and it would be them like howling at the moon, and then there's just like the glowy purples and blues all around them. It's like they did that, and then like they put it in. I thought it was a nice touch. And I also think the way it does the transformation makes this thing way more tragic, because you have to fully go through the process of him losing his humanity and ability to understand his family, knowing he's never going to be able to get back to the way he was. If they had done a better job fleshing out those characters, because that is an issue with this, they feel very flat in aspects of this would have been hitting so hard. One of my main complaints though, and this might just be because the theater here kind of sucks, it was way too dark. There were literally moments towards the end I just flat out couldn't see anything that was happening, and then early on it just felt so shadowed, not even shadowed, but just like half lit, that it was hurting my eyes. But again, that's something that can just be changing theater to theater. But let's dive on in, which means spoilers. So many spoilers. We're just gonna go through this whole thing. But real quick, today's video is brought to you by you, my lovely Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members. Thank you for all that you do. And if you're new here and end up enjoying, maybe give me a little subscribe. That would be neat. So the movie actually sets us up right away to see that this isn't like a traditional werewolf thing by pointing out that in 1995, a hiker disappeared in the Oregon mountains, but pretty soon locals started to see an animalistic creature on 2 legs they believed was the hiker who'd contracted something called hill fever, or as the local indigenous community called it, and apologies for butchering this, the Ma'ingan Odengwan, or face of the wolf. And again, I think that's a cool way to switch up the lore and how infection works. Obviously, werewolves are a thing that came up with old folklore, so there's lots of different interpretations of how that could happen, but they don't actually end up going any deeper on that or how the infection works. It just feels like they didn't even need to explain this or have this intro. If you just let what happens in the movie happen, you kind of pick up the same amount of information as they're showing here when they don't want to go any deeper on it. But we pick up with a young Blake who's clearly got some anxiety around his father and how strict he is. Like the second he says up, he's popped out of bed, making it pristine, flattening it out. You learn that his father has this deep fear of the woods around them, and it's led him to be pretty militant in his parenting, having that fear turn into anger. But honestly, some of those fears seem a little bit warranted when Blake runs off to get a better angle on a deer and catches some humanoid creature in his sights on 2 legs that almost instantly disappears. And the tension here is so good. His dad gets to him, realizes something's out there, he's terrified, it's climbing towards them in the deer stand, hot breath is just coming out in the cool air. So you're just waiting for this thing to like bust in at them or pop in from another angle. Like it even starts panning more over the dad's shoulder, so you're like, oh shit, he's coming from behind. Before it eventually leaves them alone, and the dad notices like the desecrated deer carcass and almost manages to shoot him before it runs off into the woods. And yeah, fantastic scene, no notes, it perfectly sets the stage. And then after that, you find out that the dad knows what it is. He's talking on the CB radio to another local, saying that like, we gotta hunt it down to protect our boys. Again, specifically saying that whatever it is referred to as the face of the wolf, like it's like a local superstition or some creature that they should be trying to avoid. So again, they didn't need to show us that thing in the intro because they're just giving us the information all over again. Because then it just cuts to 30 years later and the stuff in the past is just all gone. And I must note, they make sure to show us that the dad has a tattoo with their last name on his arm, which I just knew had to be some kind of foreshadowing, because what's a really easy way to identify someone if they kind of stop looking like themselves? Tattoos. But yeah, 30 years later, and Blake is father extraordinaire to Ginger in between writing jobs while his wife Charlotte is a workaholic journalist who struggled to connect with their child. And there's clearly some animosity between the two in the relationship. I assume it's like her feeling like she's doing too much of the work even though she's addicted to her career, and him feeling like she's not making time for the family. But almost immediately it lets us know that Blake has unintentionally picked up some of his father's behaviors when he gets scared for Ginger's safety. Pretty quickly bringing us back to that cycle of trauma idea. He snaps at her but immediately starts to apologize, saying that's not who he is and not who he wants to be. I am not my father is basically flashing above his head in a neon light. Because yes, even though he grew up around a literal beast man, his father ultimately caused him the most damage, and the two don't talk. Actually, it seems like his father dropped off the map at some point entirely. And this ends up being the day that the state made the determination that his dad must have died somewhere in the woods and releases the farm back to Blake. Oh man, his father who was trying to hunt down a wolfman completely disappeared. I wonder what happened. Best case scenario, he got eaten off by said wolfman, or worst case scenario, he is new wolfman. And with how the movie's been setting up that generational trauma, I'm just gonna assume that's the case. Blake doesn't have this thought though. It seems like he forgot that day 30 years ago and the things he heard his father say, and maybe his dad just never continued to talk about this thing, but he just wants to pack up his family for a summer trip to go deal with all the stuff at his dad's place and see it as an opportunity to reconnect with the family because things aren't going so great in the marriage. And I'd like to think that if you remembered the fact that there was some creepy animal out there, that maybe you wouldn't bring your family. But whatever. It is a really horrible feeling watching him put out all this vulnerability, knowing that a disaster is going to strike them after he says there's just such a short amount of time we have with people. Man just wants to enjoy some time with his family and you know that's not gonna happen. Also, fuck you, Wolfman. Sometimes it's just completely out of your hand if people don't want to be with you. And sometimes we all just realize a little bit too late. Anyway, overall, I actually felt like this conversation went on for a little bit too long. It gets a bit awkward instead of just showing us that she struggles as a mom because she's always working. They just have to have her say it. But whatever, she agrees to go out on this wilderness journey, and I thought they were gonna do some like really creepy tense stuff here, like he ends up stopping the truck when he can't remember which way to take to the farm, and the kid sees something looming in one of those deer stands, and I'm like, oh shit, is it gonna disappear the second he looks up, and is it gonna be the Wolfman? Are we gonna trickle tease him into the story? But no, it's Derek. Who's Derek? He's the son of the guy that Blake's dad was talking to on the CB radio, telling him about the Wolfman encounter all those years ago. And he's a pretty ominous dude. Like he hops in to help them get to the farm, and it starts to feel like they might be setting up for like a locals versus city slickers thing. Like you left this behind, why are you here? With how he's talking about how Blake needs to feel so lucky for having this beautiful family and for getting out. But immediately after that statement, Blake accidentally drives off the road trying to avoid this animalistic figure on two legs. And somehow it's the guy who never left the crazy wilderness and definitely knows about the Wolfman because he was just talking about this like crazy infection in the region and all the weird things with animals, who immediately opens the door to the truck when it's suspended sideways and falls to knock himself out basically, leaving him completely open to be drug away by the Wolfman, but not before it manages to scratch Blake in the arm, dooming him before they even have time to pretend to be a happy family. Usually they're allowed to at least start living their happy facade in horror before it gets ripped away. So yeah, nothing really ends up explored there, and no room to get deeper on the lore this movie set up to set itself apart from typical werewolf stories. But they narrowly make it into the house just in time, not knowing what's hunting them and not knowing whether or not it plans to stick around. Which is when they must once again detour to let us know that Blake is just trying so hard not to be his father, apologizing for failing to keep Ginger safe and having her see something so traumatic, saying he'd never forgive himself if it stayed with her, which like, buddy, she saw someone like get drug away in the woods after a car accident. I'm pretty sure that's gonna stick with her. And also, we just know it's about to get so much worse. This is her favorite parent and he has a ticking time bomb. And again, just really making sure we're getting that idea of generational trauma with him saying that sometimes parents are so afraid of their kids getting scars that they become the thing that scars them. And yeah, at this point, I feel like we get it. I feel like that point's been made. So he and Charlotte try to figure out a way out. They're trying to reach help with the CB radio, but that infection seems to quickly be settling in on Blake. His sense of smell goes way up, but then he starts losing his teeth. Then they finally realize the gash on his arm, which is definitely from an animal and super infected. Oh no, hill fever. And from here, he just progressively starts to get more agitated. Definitely has a fever setting in, leading to a shorter temper. He's losing more teeth. It is coming on fast. With those heightened senses essentially becoming a nightmare when his super hearing makes it sound like the creature is upstairs like scrambling around, but it's actually just a very large spider. Leads to a cool moment though. He can hear that the beast is kind of lurking around outside and is like reverse hunting it from inside the house, except somehow he forgot about the doggy door and gets nabbed. Like, the first thing he did when they got in the house was go around and make sure that all the windows and the doors were shut and locked. And he missed the doggy door? I will say it got me. I wasn't expecting the doggy door, even though they showed us a dog in the opening scene of the movie. It was a nice touch. He manages to get away with it though when Charlotte bashes it with a hammer, but now he's just having this like full fit before he passes out into what seems like a different reality. Because when he wakes up, everything is off. It's this like glowing bluish purple and he can't understand anything they're saying. Like mentally he thinks he's speaking English, but it's just not coming out as actual words and all he hears is like echoey garbles.
What is happening? I can't understand you.
And I really like the way that they shifted this scene into what he's seeing into what it actually looks like in the basement. Like it's glowy in his perspective, almost like there's this weird unnatural fluorescent light all around, but then it's actually near pitch darkness while Charlotte is trying to reach people on the CB radio. Again, really driving home what we already know with what she's saying, that she thinks her husband was infected by an animal and now he's just not himself. But this is where we really start to notice that slow burn transformation starting to tick up and get a little bit more intense. Like even just from waking up to making it downstairs, his face is starting to change. Like there's something wrong with his skin, and then he pisses himself. It appears that the dog in him is not house trained. But even though he can't talk, he can still spell, kinda, like his hands are starting to lock up in a weird way, but he knows he's dying. Which is when she starts to realize how much she actually appreciates him, which is a pretty shitty thing to realize when it's too late. Telling him that he's her best friend and that she doesn't want to do anything in life without him. That shit almost had me crying, and again, if they had done a little bit more character work building into it, probably would have. The main focus of this movie is clearly that generational trauma, but there's also the idea of grief here and not appreciating the time you have with a person. I've also seen people compare this to having to deal with family members going through dementia, which makes sense and was interesting. But he can't understand a word of what they're saying and just sees their eyes as these glowing orbs, which again, I thought was really cool. And you just progressively start to see more changes to his face and his mannerisms here, and realize that not only is the scratch on his arm getting way worse, it's actually infected its way all the way down to the bone, which he then starts to furiously itch before he starts to chew on it. And he's actually eating his own flesh and just losing more teeth. Super tasty, a mess all around. It's kind of funny in a sad way though when he snaps out of it and he just like looks all sad and ashamed about what's happening, like he's just conveying so much with his eyes. Chris Rabbit is so good at that. He's just so good at looking like a sad little boy. But Charlotte finally notices an old truck by the barn, and they do actually manage to get it started for their escape, but it's just in time for Wolfman Sr. to bust through that front window. And again, great tension here because you know it's coming, you just don't know when and from where. But while she's focused on getting the truck started, his face is just continuing to completely change. Like he's losing his brow ridge, his bottom jaw is starting to jut forward, he's got new weird teeth growing in, his hair is falling out. It's happening fast. I know Chris and I think Leigh have both said that this all took inspiration from The Fly and other body horrors, and I think that slower, lengthier transformation made for a really interesting flip up on the werewolf lore. I know I said that before, but seeing it in action through the movie, I think is really cool. So they run and hide on top of the greenhouse where the daughter obviously almost falls through and Blake runs off into the woods to lure the beast away so Charlotte and Ginger can make it back inside. And that kid is pissed that mommy just abandoned daddy, the parent she actually loves. But even that just becomes, no, he had to go away to protect you because he loves you. He does somehow manage to get away from it and is just waiting to be let inside, which she does, even though it's pretty clear that he's only a couple steps away from being the same mindless beast that they're running from. She even lets the kid wander right up to him when he's clearly unwell and entirely unrecognizable. He doesn't hurt her though, just proceeds to puke up a bunch of blood and the finger he apparently ate off the other wolf guy. Incredible. But even with the moments where he's clearly losing his sense of self, his family seems to ground him. At least enough to not be attacked so far. He even goes to leave so he doesn't do something to them, which is when Wolfman was waiting outside to crash in at him, so it's like a full-on brawl, and the more we see him, the more I'm convinced of my earlier thought that this is Blake's dad who also ended up infected. Which is confirmed immediately after Blake kills him because yes, they show us the tattoo. So damn, not only does Blake know he's never gonna get better, he also just killed his dad who ended up becoming the one thing he wanted to destroy and ended up turning his kid into the one thing he was trying to protect him from. Wow, sometimes parents really do become the thing that scars their kids. Literally. But even if they didn't show that and make it painfully obvious with the actual events of the movie, they will once again give us line delivery to both explain what's literally happening on screen and the allegory. Ginger asks why daddy had to get sick, which is just a weird question to ask at the moment. I think I'd be more on the like, what the fuck is that and why is daddy turning into it train? But it's really just so that they can have Charlotte say, well, daddy's dad got sick and I think he passed that sickness on to daddy. The sins of the father. Like, I think it's pretty obvious that his dad being the one to infect him is an allegory for that trauma being passed down even when someone's aware that that's what they could become. They don't always have the ability to stop it, but cool, if for some reason you didn't pick up on the multiple obvious moments where they're pointing that out to you, the movie just made sure to tell you in exact words. And while that's going on, he's outside completing his transformation. It's very tragic, but again, what they see is wild, like it's glowing forest, amazing. But it also seems like he's losing more and more of his mind, meaning his ability to recognize and protect his family is probably dwindling, so Charlotte has to set up a bear trap for him in the barn. Another pretty cool scene where he can see them perfectly and they just can't see him at all. Honestly though, in my theater, this scene was so dark that it pulled out a lot of the tension because you just genuinely couldn't see anything that was going on from their perspective. But the bear trap. So that kind of ended up being a little callback to Saw, because when he can't open it, he chews his own foot off to get out. It's so funny. It's so intense. So they're running out into the woods right back where the truck is. They find Derek's gun and pieces of Derek, climb up into that deer stand that I assume is the same one from when Blake was a kid, as the sun starts to come up, paralleling that opening scene. His breath starts to rise in that cool air as he slowly climbs up the ladder, not immediately attacking them, just looking so sad. And I really expected the kid to be freaking out and like begging the mom not to kill him because they could still fix him. But there's been this like ongoing bit about how she can read minds the whole movie, but it's always just that he loves her. But now she says that he just wants this to be over. He knows he's just going to keep losing moments of clarity and doesn't want to be this thing forever, and obviously doesn't want to literally kill his family. So Charlotte has to shoot him. And the last thing he sees is just those beautiful treetops that he was looking at when he was a kid before he dies. And the last thing they see is that beautiful valley he told Charlotte about that, according to him, just makes everything feel okay when you see it. But yeah, I don't know about that. Pretty horrific shit. You just had to watch the horrible decline of your husband and father and then shoot him. Like, there's definitely a traumatized kid in there. Not sure if a valley can fix all that. But yeah, that's the movie. And by the end, it almost does feel a little bit like, so yeah, you can't avoid that. You can't avoid that generational trauma no matter how hard you try. So you might as well just remove yourself from the situation to not fuck up your kids. I get that it couldn't just have the happy ending, but unfortunately there were some really interesting ideas introduced that I find mostly get relegated to that opening title card. It's like mostly like an exposition dump before it just tries to pad the runtime with them in the house as he starts getting more and more sick. I think whannell started writing this during COVID, so there might have just been this idea of being stir crazy in a home, but they could have added more stuff. They could have done a little bit more with the environment. They could have done a lot more tense moments. They could have even found ways to introduce more of the lore. Like the dad had been doing research for years, and they even showed us a notepad where he was like kind of keeping track of where it was and what it liked to do. And I would have liked them to come across some of that and just see what they're dealing with instead of just kind of like letting it all happen to them. But I'm also a big lore fan, but it just felt like there was more things that could have been done during the runtime. Again, like I mentioned earlier, I think more of the locals would have been cool. I know there weren't many left and they were very scattered across the mountains, but they just did like a lot of setup to have it kind of go nowhere and just be overly stranded in the house. And what makes it kind of worse is that even though it was so contained to the three of them, it still ends up feeling so shallow. Like some of these main characters feel a little bit like side characters and not like key people to the plot. And for how much it's beating us over the head with the sins of the father, the trauma being passed down, it doesn't really seem like it did all that much after it like force fed the importance to us in case people just couldn't get it from the context clues. Like you absolutely had to know it was a thing, but it still feels like they got lazy with it. But yeah, that's Wolfman, the modern take, some interesting stuff in there, but ultimately just kind of feels a little bit bland and just so many little nuggets that could have gone further that just don't. I will prop it for the areas that it had good tension and were effective in the horror area, but it just wasn't enough to really to bump this into something that was like really good or solid. But hey, I know some people are really loving this one and some people are hating it way more than I ended up finding it. So let me know what you guys are thinking down below, but that's going to do it for today's video. Thank you all so much for watching. Thanks as always to my Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members. Subscribe to the channel if you're new, leave a like on the video if you're into that kind of thing. All my social medias are listed down below. I hope you're having a fantastic day. I'm mostly okay, and we'll catch you all later.